Graham Hancock says, "This symbol appears all over the world. We see it in Mexico, we see it in India, we see it in Mesopotamia, everywhere. I believe that this symbolism dates back to a distant era, at least 11,600 years ago. The fact is that these identical bags are held by beings who are considered to be the bringers of civilization." And isn't that strange? Although ancient cultures were located in different corners of the world and never officially encountered each other, they all knew the same mysterious handbag motif. But what is the background of these strange images? Are they just ordinary everyday objects, or do they have a much greater significance? Well, alternative researchers such as Graham Hancock are convinced that these bags hold a historical truth that will throw official history into absolute chaos. But what speaks for this exciting assumption? And what speaks against it? Let's open the door to the past together and get to the bottom of this fascinating topic. Why these mysterious objects are referred to as handbags is obvious. With their rounded, handle-like upper part and rectangular lower part, they do indeed resemble our modern carry bags. Often decorated with patterns or other additional details, however, the structures immediately raise the question of what they are supposed to be. Were the objects really only used to store and transport mundane everyday items? Fortunately, it's not quite as unspectacular as that. This becomes clear when we consider who usually carry these mysterious handbags. As the Hancock quote mentioned at the beginning suggests, these were not ordinary people but bringers of civilization, or more precisely, gods and other mythical beings. But first things first, what these objects really are, what they represent, and what their background is cannot be said with certainty today. One theory is based on the assumption that these small bags, which at first glance appear rather inconspicuous, are supposed to represent something much greater, namely, the entire cosmos. What we would commonly interpret as a handle is nothing more than the hemisphere of the sky. We can equate the base with the Earth, and we know from ancient cultures in Africa, India, and China that such symbolism was anything but uncommon many centuries ago. Circular or semicircular motifs were often interwoven with immaterial, that is, spiritual ideas, while square images, such as the underside of the bag, represented the material and earthly. Furthermore, we know that the roots of these mysterious bags go back a long way, more precisely to one of the oldest structures ever built by humans. In fact, the images also catch our eye on the ancient ruins of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. And while the history of this settlement site can be traced back to the 10th millennium BC, the exact purpose of the mountain sanctuary has still not been uncovered. Given that only 1.5% of the site has been explored so far, this is not really surprising. However, since the walls and pillars of the temple are adorned with finely crafted animals, gods, and ominous creatures, it seems reasonable to conclude that Göbekli Tepe served as a venue for religious ceremonies and animal sacrifices. The spiritual worship may have been aimed at the fundamental elements of earthly life, symbolized by the three cosmic handbags. Confusing parallels. We have already told you that this motif also appeared in many other places around the globe, but it gets even more astonishing when we realize how similar the individual handbags are in their design. Let's take a look at two stone reliefs, one made by the Olmecs in ancient Mesoamerica, and the other by the Assyrians in what is now Iraq. In both cases, we see a man-like figure carrying a handbag, as if it were a basket or a carrier bag. According to theory, the Assyrian bag contained a kind of magical dust, while in Olmec culture, it contained intoxicating herbs that enabled contact with the gods. And even in distant New Zealand, we find evidence of this. An ancient Maori legend tells of a hero who ascended to the realm of the gods and received 3 baskets full of wisdom. Similar to the Göbekli Tepe bags, their New Zealand counterparts symbolize reverence and gratitude for divinely inspired knowledge. The ancient Egyptians were also familiar with the handbag motif. Here, the objects represented the home of the gods. But how can all these parallels be explained? Could it really be just an amazing coincidence? What is certain is that so many different cultures use the same image to convey a more or less identical meaning, even though they never officially crossed paths. And perhaps we should note at this point that handbags are not an isolated case. In fact, they are by no means the only mysterious symbols that we encounter in all corners of the world and which experts are still puzzling over today. After all, there are also the fir and pine cones. And what, by definition, are merely the woody, spiked female inflorescences of coniferous trees, symbolized fertility and eternal life in ancient times. For example, the staff of the Egyptian god of the dead, Osiris, was adorned with a pine cone, while many Hindu gods hold them in their hands. Consequently, it is no coincidence that Shiva's hair resembles a classic pine cone. After all, in combination with the depiction of snakes, this symbolizes a higher spiritual consciousness. Assyrian carvings are also adorned with divine beings holding pine cones aloft, as is the statue of a Mexican deity. However, some people believe that all these supernatural symbols also have an earthly, or more precisely, an anatomical background. According to this belief, the cones could represent the pineal gland, which is said to open the so-called third eye and remove the boundary between the earthly and supernatural worlds. The astonishing theories from the alternative camp. It seems obvious that the pockets and cones were closely interwoven with the religious beliefs of their creators. Every people had its own unique belief in the existence of supernatural beings who guide earthly destinies and are literally not of this world. But what is the background to this belief? How did belief in gods become so firmly entrenched in the minds of our ancestors? Did religions and mythologies really arise simply as attempts to explain questions that could not be answered? Well, that depends on who you ask, of course. Graham Hancock is convinced that the mythical handbag carriers do not represent deities in the classical religious sense. To understand what this means, we need to briefly recall the basic beliefs of the British alternative researcher. Hancock has no doubt that long before our time, a highly developed civilization lived on Earth, but was wiped out by a global natural disaster at the end of the last ice age. The few survivors then set out into the world to bring the gift of civilization to simpler peoples. In other words, the civilization rise of ancient peoples did not arise from an independent cultural evolution, but was served to them on a silver platter from outside. The followers of the precursor culture revealed higher knowledge to them and were revered as miraculous gods because of their progressiveness. In reality, however, they were ordinary people who were simply generations ahead of their contemporaries. And this is precisely what the widely used handbag symbolism is supposed to reinforce. According to Hancock, the depictions have a common root, because it cannot be a coincidence that the motifs were used independently of each other all over the world. We would therefore be dealing with direct evidence of the influence of a global predecessor civilization. But what exactly are the bags? Well, on the one hand, we could be dealing with a symbolic container in which the groundbreaking knowledge of the culture bearers was stored and passed on. Alternatively, some supporters of this theory speculate that we are really dealing with tangible objects, more precisely, futuristic devices that suggest lost advanced technology and were possibly used to generate energy. And if you think it can't get any more unconventional, you should hear what the pre-astronautics enthusiasts have to say about handbags. Basically, this paranormal movement is based on the assumption that ancient peoples were regularly visited by extraterrestrials. Against this backdrop, religious accounts such as the rapture of Enoch or the appearance of God in the book of Ezekiel are always placed in an alien context, because in reality, they were close encounters of the third kind or UFO sightings. And when it comes to handbags, pre-astronautic enthusiasts sometimes refer to the Maori tradition mentioned briefly earlier. As mentioned above, the hero ascended to the House of the Gods, where he received 3 baskets full of wisdom. With a little imagination, this story can now be interpreted to mean that the ascent to the realm of the gods was nothing more than a visit to an extraterrestrial spaceship. And according to pre-astronautics, the revelation of knowledge is still visible to us today. Accordingly, the extraterrestrial visitors would have shown the inhabitants of ancient times advanced technologies and helped them erect many monumental buildings. It cannot be denied that such theories seem unusual, to put it mildly, but it is undisputed that many buildings of the past are still shrouded in mystery. For example, we do not even know in detail how the ancient Egyptians managed to build their colossal pyramids from the ground up. Other sites, such as the Sun Gate of Tiwanaku or Pumapunku in Bolivia, also give rise to speculation. But do the unanswered questions of the past necessarily mean that aliens must have been at work here? Well, not really, because such theories are just as open to criticism and cannot be proven. It takes a certain amount of imagination to reconcile the influence of extraterrestrial intelligence with real history. But who knows? Perhaps that is ultimately what makes this controversial topic so fascinating. And if you take a moment to look into the subscribe button now, you'll never miss another video from us. Just click on the thumb and subscribe to stay up to date from now on. See you soon!